Okay, welcome everybody. We are at 7 o'clock, so we'll get started here. We are at our Explore Lakes with New Hampshire Lakes webinar series. And this evening, we are going to have a presentation on water quality friendly lawn care. We are joined by Julia Peterson, the Water Resources State Specialist at the UNH Cooperative Extension, and Emma Erler, who previously worked at UNH Cooperative Extension and now has a new position at the Squam Lakes Natural Science Center. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get going. We are recording, as you heard, so that we can provide this after the fact. We do ask that you stay on mute during the presentation, just so we don't have any background noise. If it allows at the end while we do questions, Julia has asked that we let people ask those, so we may have you unmute yourselves. And we do ask that you leave your cameras off for the presentation, just to help with our feed, and so we don't have a lot of distraction. Anytime during our presentation, you are more than welcome to type questions into our chat box, and if we are able to provide answers to you directly during the presentation, we'll go ahead and do that. If our team does not know the answer, we will certainly go ahead and wait and give those questions to Julia and Emma at the end of the session. And tomorrow you'll receive an evaluation form from us. Please do share your feedback. We will also be sharing that with Julia and Emma. We always are looking for ways to improve. We also would love for you to let us know if you have ideas for different presentations you're looking for. All those types of questions you can type into there. We also provide an email with the presentation also. And now I'll just do a quick little backstory of New Hampshire Lakes in case you're not familiar with us. We are the only publicly supported nonprofit organization working for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. You can become a supporter and help us provide programming like this one at newhampshirelakes.org. We want to help keep our lakes clean and healthy for now and in the future. We work with partners like UNH, Cooperative Extension, and Squam Lake Science Center to promote clean water policies and responsible use and inspire the public to care for our lakes. And we do that through 3 programs. We have an advocacy program where we are helping shape the legislation at the State House. We have our conservation program where we run our lake host program, checking boats as they come in and out of the lake to make sure we're not spreading invasive species. We also have our Lake Smart program, which is geared towards homeowners. You can do Lake Smart things right on your own property that are going to help the lake, whether you live right on the shoreline or miles from it. And we're certainly going to hear some Lake Smart tips today about how your lawn can affect water quality. And we also have our outreach program, which is bringing you this webinar series. We are also very excited that we're going to get back to our in-person Lakes Congress event this year. That's happening on June 2nd and 3rd, and registration is open. So if you love a lake and you want to learn more about the ways you can help it, certainly go ahead and register and come see us in person at the beginning of June. We are your hosts this evening. I'm Erin Mastine, the outreach coordinator, and Gloria Norcross is here somewhere, and she's going to be assisting this evening as well. She's our conservation program assistant. We thank her for joining also. And our expert presenters, Julia and Emma. And at this time, I'll go ahead and turn this over to you so we can get to the good stuff. And let me just stop sharing my screen here and turn it right over.
Thanks, Erin. Good evening, everybody. I'm Julia Peterson, again with New Hampshire Sea Grant and UNH Cooperative Extension, here with my former colleague and current collaborator, Emma Erler. I'm going to start my slides. So thanks to all of you. Well, thanks to Erin and New Hampshire Lakes, and thanks to all of you for participating tonight and joining us on this really important topic. I know it's something that we get a lot of interest from at UNH. So our goals today, of course, are to recognize the connection between lawn care and clean water, and to learn some cultural practices. And by cultural practices, I'm talking about those practices that we use to grow and maintain turf areas and lawns. Those cultural practices are really going to focus on how can we produce lawns and plants that are healthy enough that they can withstand wear and tear, they can withstand drought conditions, they can withstand low levels of nutrients, and they can withstand damage from pests. Hopefully you'll find something that you can either adopt for your own household or that you can promote to others that you work with. All right, so in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and type in the answer to this question. Who takes care of your lawn? Is it you, someone else in your household? Maybe you have a service? Type that right in. We'll take a look. Okay, getting a few answers in here. Good, good. We especially love it when the person who does the lawn care in the family is present. Great. All right, so in terms of our content tonight, and I would welcome, Emma and I think would welcome questions and comments at any time. Go ahead and type those into the chat and we'll pause occasionally and bring those up. So we'll cover sort of that land water connection, maybe information that you are already familiar with, but I just want to make sure that we're sort of starting on the same page. Then I'll go through a set of lawn care recommendations that help us to grow that kind of robust turf without the use of fertilizer. And then Emma's going to cover some lawn care recommendations with fertilizer, and then we'll do a little wrap. So just to make sure we're starting on the same page, just a little foundational information. I just want to take a minute to review the water cycle. Of course, we're familiar with water evaporating into clouds, right? The cold temperatures cause that to drop out as precipitation. Then that precipitation, of course, hits the ground and it either infiltrates and percolates into the groundwater, or depending on the surface of the earth, right, it might run off. A couple of points that I really want to point out here. One is that making sure that we notice that groundwater is connected to surface water. Really, all the surface water is, right, is a place where the ground has been, there's a depression that meets the level of the water table. So making sure we see that connection. And the other is taking note of the fact that there's this surface runoff, especially in places where the surface of the earth is hardened. And that could be anywhere that there's pavement, asphalt, any hard surface, including compacted ground. All right. Another concept we just want to keep in mind is, of course, this concept of the watershed, right? And a watershed is the word that we use to describe all of the land area that drains into a particular water body. We name a watershed for the water body into which that precipitation drains. So just sort of keeping that in mind. This white boundary you see on this watershed illustration, right, or diagram, marks the high points on the land that create the boundaries of that watershed. And here's what we have discovered about what happens on the surface of the earth and how that relates to the water cycle. So in an undeveloped area, a natural area, in other words, about 50% of that precipitation or rainwater that lands on the ground actually soaks in. Those of us who get our water from wells, right, we're really grateful for this because that's groundwater recharge, we call that. About 40% of it might run off under these conditions and these circumstances, and about 40% transpires. In a highly developed area, take a look at these percentages and you'll notice that they kind of flip, right? Now we have, it's only 15% soaking in to wherever there are green spaces in this highly urbanized environment, about 55% running off, and about 30% in that evapotranspiration cycle. So you'll notice wherever those hard surfaces are, and we sometimes call them impervious cover, how does stormwater end up in a water body? Well, it might just shed right off of that impervious cover right into a water body. Or maybe, again, in a highly urbanized area, you'll see it flow down the storm drain. That storm drain just leads to a set of pipes that eventually go into the nearest water body. So whether that's a lake river, stream, or where I live, a coastal area, a beach or bay. So a couple things I want you to note, right, is that if we wouldn't throw anything into our favorite lake, then we shouldn't go on the ground because it all ends up. When we talk about water pollution in New England, right, we typically talk about these 5 major categories. Sediment, and this, so sediment, of course, being any sand and silt pathogens are, when we talk about pathogens, we're referring to disease-causing bacteria and viruses. Toxic contaminants, we're referring to those things that we think of as harmful chemicals, salt. We recognize these as chlorides that end up in water bodies. If any of you are lake monitors, you might be familiar with taking some measurements there. The one we're going to focus on, or the category we're going to focus on tonight, of course, are the excess nutrients. Again, you can see all of these non-point sources of pollution, right? That's another word for, another term we use to describe stormwater runoff or polluted runoff, right? Accumulate on these impervious cover areas. And these, and all of this runoff is actually exacerbated, of course, by intense rainfall, the kind that we see with climate, with a changing climate. So when we talk specifically about excess nutrients, we're talking about, with water quality, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus. So you know that these nutrients are necessary for life. However, in excess, they become pollutants. And what they do, generally speaking, is they stimulate aquatic plant growth, right? Just the way they stimulate terrestrial plant growth, but in a water environment that results in murky water and low dissolved oxygen levels. Can also trigger cyanobacteria. So many of you may have been familiar with cyanobacteria blooms around your, in your favorite lake or pond. And you know that when there's a cyanobacteria bloom, you can't go in the water, and it's very important not to, for your pets and people not to ingest this water. Nitrates are also a health hazard when they're in drinking water, especially for babies. So where do all these nutrients come from, right? And that's the tricky part about nutrient pollution, right? Because they come from many, many different sources. They come from atmospheric emissions, from industry and power production. They come from wastewater treatment. They come from agriculture. They come from residential areas. So they're very ubiquitous in the environment. And that's one of the big challenges behind controlling nutrients. So tonight, our presentation really focuses on what is it that we can do around our homes, and in particular, with regard to our lawns, in terms of reducing the likelihood that excess nutrients are going to run off. I want to take a minute to talk about what it is that talk in a little detail about what it is that those excess nutrients do. I had mentioned it briefly, but I want to get into a little specifics. So we have this term eutrophication. Eutrophication describes a natural process. However, when excess nutrients get into a water body, it accelerates this natural process. Nitrogen is considered the limiting nutrient in coastal waters, in estuaries, in oceans. Phosphorus is considered the limiting nutrient in fresh waters. However, they sometimes kind of build upon each other. In any case, they have this similar effect, which is that the nutrients cause an increase in phytoplankton, which can create an algae bloom. Eventually, those algae die, and they start to decay and decompose with the help of bacteria. The bacteria are aerobic bacteria. They use oxygen in that decomposition process. And that robs the water of oxygen. Of course, we measure oxygen in water, right, in very small units. So there's not much oxygen dissolved within water in the first place. There's really no excess to lose. So of course, limited oxygen means limited aquatic life. Another thing that happens is typically these submerged aquatic vegetation, healthy plants, in water bodies will ordinarily pull nutrients out of the water, right, for their own growth. However, when these algae blooms shade the aquatic plants, then they're no longer able to photosynthesize. So again, we get sort of it, and they die off, again, contributing to this decomposition. So we get kind of a triple whammy when we have an algae. Couple of characteristics of phosphorus and nitrogen that I wanted to mention. One is that sediment, phosphorus clings to sediment. And of course, sediment enters water bodies anytime we have erosion. So I mention this because I think these are principles that we can apply to all kinds of aspects of how we care for our property. Nitrogen is an interesting nutrient because it transforms. It's very fickle in the environment. It transforms from compound to compound. A few important things I want you to note. And one is that when nitrogen is in the atmosphere, it's not usable by living things. However, once that nitrogen gets transformed, and one way it gets transformed is by nitrogen-fixing bacteria attached to the root nodules of legumes. Legumes such as soybeans, other forms of beans, and white clover. So you may hear a recommendation about lawns related to clover. That nitrogen, those nitrogen-fixing bacteria transform that atmospheric nitrogen into forms of nitrogen that are usable by living things, right? Nitrogen is critical for protein synthesis. So all living things need nitrogen. Another thing that happens, right, within healthy soils is that the decomposers will decompose any living thing back into its component nitrogen, nutrients, and those nutrients get released into the soil. At that point, at some point, there are denitrifying bacteria, which take those forms of nitrogen usable by living things and transform them back into atmospheric nitrogen. Interestingly, these denitrifying bacteria do their work very well in saturated soils. So if any of you are on your conservation commissions, you are very familiar with the importance of wetlands and protecting wetlands. And that's because wetlands help remove, right, and transform usable forms of nitrogen back into atmospheric nitrogen. So of course, we're talking about lawns tonight, right? Which are just property by property, but the practices that we use on our properties multiply. Of course, the gold standard for water resource protection is land conservation. Second to that, I would say it's riparian buffer. Anytime that we can have trees and shrubs holding soils, preventing erosion, right, and filtering water, that's when we get the cleanest water. Sometimes we have to sort of engineer those systems. Here you see a rain garden, which is basically a semi-engineered way of treating water. So this is a rain garden that we installed at a property in Portsmouth. And it's a little bit hard to see, but this rain garden, right? The spigot from this house is coming down. We just buried the little pipe right here. And it's taking the water that was on the roof, which is an impervious surface, and transferring it right here into a rain garden where it can be infiltrated and filtered by the plants in healthy soils. When we have environments that are absent, right, healthy plants and soils, then that's when we see the most polluted water draining right into our water. At this point, any questions or comments? Okay, somebody's looking for some information about grubs. I think Emma will be able to touch on that. All right, I'm going to move right along. All right, so the recommendations that we'll be providing tonight are focused on a set of recommendations that came out of a study that we did in the late 2000s. And the reason this study was important is that for the first time, I was working with colleagues in other institutions, universities within the New England region, and we all recognized the potential for lawn fertilizer to create water quality problems. So we asked an agronomist who actually specialized in nutrients and water quality and turf. He's a turf scientist and an agronomist. We asked him to provide some recommendations for us with a scientific rationale that were appropriate for our region, for Northern New England and for Southern New England, for phosphorus and for nitrogen. And this became the foundation of the recommendations that you're going to be hearing about tonight. We also worked with a social scientist, and we said to that social scientist, can you help us learn more about what people are already doing on their lawns, what they're willing to do, what practices they might be willing to adopt, what practices they're not willing to adopt, and how we might communicate our outreach in ways that are going to be most effective. Let's see, tonight we're going to ask you a couple of questions that mimic the questions from the survey that our social scientists did. So let's see how this group compares to some of those responses that we got. So I am not gonna, let me say, I don't have access to my poll tonight. However, let's take a look at what the survey said. So what matters to people in New England regarding lawns? Here you see our number one was the importance of having a safe lawn for the environment. The survey went out to random groups of people in what we call urbanizing watersheds. So these were towns that were not extremely urban, not super rural, but sort of somewhere in between, again, throughout New England. And so that was very important. So this was really important to us as outreach specialists to say, okay, it's worthwhile trying to conduct some outreach on this topic because people are interested. Next, you see pest-free lawn was important to a lot of people, thick grass, and weed-free. So we might have to figure out, okay, how can we promote these messages in ways that are going to give people the other aspects that they're looking for in their lawn quality. I'm going to jump right into the recommendations. So these are pretty straightforward, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what the exact recommendations are and a little bit about the scientific rationale behind them, why they work. All right, so one of the first things we do, and this we find interesting, it's often about what life stage people are in, right? So encouraging people to limit the lawn areas to places where they play and picnic. And that may change for people depending on what life stage they are, right? We all need places to play and to picnic. I need a place to hang my laundry, right? But there are times when you might want to convert part of your property into wildflower or into some sort of a meadow or into ground cover. Another aspect related to that is recognizing that lawns, turf actually has a seasonal cycle. And this is important when we think about our expectations. So we're looking out the window and we're seeing, like right about now, right? We're starting to see this green up happen. And as you notice, right, that goes right up until June, and then we start to see a bit of a decline. What I want you to know is that this is normal, right? The grass will actually, the lawn will go a little bit dormant during the hottest days of the summer and the driest days of the summer. The only way to overcome this is to irrigate or water your lawn. Some of us might think that's not the best use of water, so depending on your circumstances, right? But then recognize that under normal conditions, that lawn will bounce back and you will see green, lush lawn again into the fall. And then, of course, we get that winter dormancy again. Notice, right? It's not active during these dormant periods. So we want to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how to take care of those places. So our second recommendation, plant low maintenance grass varieties. Now, when we typically go to the store and buy some grass seed, it comes in the form of a mix. All right. We encourage people to overseed because, again, we're trying to create areas where the plants, that they will pull nutrients out of the runoff, but they will not be releasing nutrients, either leaching into the ground or running off. So just enough nutrient to keep that grass growing, but not so much that it runs. Beginning to plant new lawn, or you have a big bare space that you need to deal with, for best results, you're going to want to plant that in the early fall. All right, so when we talk about what to look for in a seed mix, these, the turf type tall fescues and the fine fescues are the rugged New Englanders of the grass species, right? They have great characteristics of heat and drought tolerant. They're very tolerant of low pH, which is typically what we have in our soils in New Hampshire and Maine. They don't mind low fertility. They can tolerate drought and shade. All right. They can be slow to establish, at least the turf type tall fescues. So that's why we need a little bit of perennial ryegrass in the mix. Perennial ryegrass germinates quickly. It's a good one when you need something to grow quickly. And then Kentucky bluegrass, we add in the mix as well. That has a high tolerance for cold and wear and tear. However, it requires higher amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. So we say 65 to 90% of your grass seed mix, fescues, and then some additional percentage of perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass. Whenever you can, incorporate clover. Again, clover is a legume, and it's going to convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen in the soil. That's going to give you fertilizer, right? We do find though, however, people have different preferences when it comes to clover. Some people love it, some people don't. Typically, we encourage people to keep that clover mix to less than 10% of your seed mix. I sprinkled clover into my lawn when I was doing a lawn renovation. A little goes a long way. The seeds are very, very tiny. Of course, disregard this recommendation if there's anybody in the household who's allergic to bee stings. So when we looked at our survey results, were people willing to have clover in their lawn? Absolutely, right? Having a clover-free lawn was not important to most people. Here's a really critical and a really simple one. Mow smart, mow high. So mow high means at least about 3 inches of grass showing there, and then leave those clippings on the lawn. The only time you might not want to leave the clippings on the lawn is if for some reason your lawn has gotten very, very, very deep and you have a real lot. Typically, we say cut a third of a blade at a time. Sorry. So mow 3 inches high, leave the clippings on the lawn. Now you'll notice in this little diagram that the more of the grass blade that you see above the soil, the deeper the roots below the soil. Again, we want to produce plants that can withstand wear and tear, drought, and pests. Are people willing to mow high and leave the clippings? Absolutely, extremely willing. So that's why we know that's a worthwhile one to promote. Water wisely. So lawns typically, especially if you mow high, you're only going to need about 1 inch of water per week. What's very handy is that in New Hampshire, that's about our average per week on an annual basis. There are occasions when you may need to water if we're having in sort of a drought situation or not getting a lot of rain. All right, and then water deeply, not frequently, and water before 10 o'clock in the morning, typically. Midday, right, the water evaporates too quickly, or if you water at night, it can lead to fungus because the plants stay damp too long in the humidity of the evening. And then, of course, we're going to encourage a soil test. What I want you to note at this point is that even without any talk about nutrients, 2 very important things that we learn about soil that will affect the quality of our lawns. One is the pH, and the other is the amount of organic matter. Now, the pH is really important because if our soil, right, where we're trying to grow our lawn, is outside this 6 to 6.5 range, what happens is the plant is not able to pick up any nutrients and the necessary minerals it needs to grow, right? So in other words, no additional, if the pH is incorrect, no amount of additional fertilizer is going to make any difference. So it's really, really important to get this pH correct. When it comes to compost or organic matter, right, we're aiming for about 3 to 5%. So if it's a new turf area, you can incorporate that compost right into your topsoil or the soil that you're where you're preparing your lawn. An important thing to note is that compost can have very high phosphorus levels. And earlier in this presentation, we talked about phosphorus being a pollutant. So it's really important to tread lightly here. If you have an existing lawn and it needs to, and that organic matter measurement needs to get a little boost, you just add about 1/4 of an inch top dressing and gently rake it in. And that will build up over time until you have a more healthy soil. And then the last one I'm going to mention in the terms of these recommendations are, you remember that bacteria is always going to be like breaking down, decomposing, right? Yard waste. So the advantage there is when we leave the clippings, they will decompose. However, if if you have a lot of clippings, you may want to compost them separately. Another thing you can do is compost your leaves or shred them, turn them into mulch. But the key is to never, ever, ever rake those grass clippings, the leaves, or any plant material into a water body, into a drainage area. Very tempting because those are usually the low-lying areas, right? Or into a storm drain catch basin, right? That's like putting nutrient pollution right into our water bodies. All right. And then if you have done those 5 or 6 recommendations, right? And you are happy with your lawn, you're done in terms of the best practices that you can do. So at this point, related to all the practices that we can do without the use of fertilizer, are there any comments or questions? You see Teresa addressed clover seed. I picked it up just at my local garden center. Yes. Pollinators, beautiful. All right. Emma, I think we're ready. And again, you can bring up these, just feel free to type those comments or questions into the chat at any time.
Great. Well, I'm happy to take over. I will warn the audience that my dog has been up to no good this evening. She just stole a sandwich off the counter downstairs. So if I seem distracted, it's because of her. But hopefully that's all gonna go smoothly. So here we go. Julia's gonna move the slides ahead for me. So first thing you need to know if we're talking fertilizer is that there are 3 main nutrients that are going to be listed on every fertilizer package. Those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is really important for growth of plants and greening. So for all that top growth on grass, that green up response in spring, that's nitrogen. Phosphorus is really important for the root systems of grass plants and also for new shoot growth. This is particularly important when you're seeding a new lawn. And then potassium, or potash as it's also known as, is good for stress resistance. So particularly in drought conditions, potassium is really, really important to making plants or grass plants healthy and strong. Okay, so in our region, typically we have plenty of phosphorus in our soils. So for most lawns, you do not need to have a fertilizer that contains a whole bunch of phosphorus. Fertilizers lawn fertilizers often have a bunch of phosphorus in them. but I will warn you that typically that is unnecessary. What's going to be really important too, really for anyone who wants to have good success with their garden, their lawn, and they want to promote water quality, is getting your soil tested. You can get your soil tested through UNH Cooperative Extension. You can also get your soil tested really through any state, what am I saying? Land grant college labs. So UMaine has a lab, UMass has a lab. So you have options, and they're also private labs as well. But if you test through UNH, this is what your results are going to look like. So you have your test data at the top, and then you have your recommendations at the bottom. And Julia already talked about pH. So what I want to pay attention to here is the list of potassium and phosphorus. And right here in this particular test, you can see that the potassium is low and the phosphorus is considered optimal. What you will also, or what you may have also noticed, is that there's no nitrogen listed here in the data. And that's just because nitrogen is really hard to accurately measure. It changes forms really quickly. And so there isn't a good way to test for that in the lab and get it accurate. So instead, your recommendations are going to come just from scientific studies that have looked at how much nitrogen certain crops need in order to grow optimally. And then that last bullet there at the bottom, you'll note that for spring and fall applications, at least 25% of the total nitrogen in the fertilizer should be derived from slow release nitrogen. Better yet, they should be derived from at least 50% slow release nitrogen, but I will touch on that more. Okay, so reading a fertilizer label, all fertilizers by law are going to have a guaranteed analysis. And what I want you to pay attention to first are the 3 numbers that are on a fertilizer bag, because every fertilizer bag will have these. These numbers, in this case, it's 12024, stand for the percent of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, in that order: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So in this case, this product is 12% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 24% potassium, or potash, if you'd rather call it that. So that's helpful. So we can gauge, just right off the bat easily whether a product's appropriate for our lawn or not. It's also critical too, when you're looking at buying a fertilizer, to know what the actual dimensions of your lawn are. So you'll need to actually calculate the area of your lawn in square feet. You'll also want to follow the instructions on that product label. Once you know the square footage of your lawn, this is pretty easy, because fertilizer products will tell you how many pounds of that product to put down per 1,000 square feet. So, and this assumes a rate of 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per application. Now, I should clarify there that 0.9 pounds of nitrogen is actual nitrogen, not the percentage of nitrogen in that product or the amount or the number of pounds you need to apply. The amount of fertilizer you need to apply varies from product to product in order to hit that ideal rate. And then you'll just need to figure out how many times you'll apply this year, whether that's 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. For most of us, I think 1, maybe 2 times is going to be more than enough. All right, so if you want to be as water quality friendly as possible, it's important to apply no more than 2 pounds of nitrogen per year. And again, that doesn't mean 2 pounds of fertilizer, that means 2 pounds of nitrogen. You can do some math here, and there are lots of great fact sheets on how to do this math, including one on the UNH Extension website. But to make it easy on yourself, this means just applying 1/2 to 1/3 of the amount of fertilizer recommended on the bag. So that's easy enough. If it recommends 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet, just apply, 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And then you'll want to look for results to decide whether or not you need to reapply. If you're using a standard quick release fertilizer, you should see those results in a couple of weeks. Slow release fertilizer over the course of many weeks. And then because that product is becoming or those nutrients are becoming gradually available to the grass. And then reapply only if you're not happy with the results of your lawn. Okay, so I mentioned this slow release nitrogen thing before. So here we are. When you are choosing a fertilizer product, you're going to want to go back to that fertilizer label, and I'll show another example of this. But you're going to want to pay attention to something that's called slow release nitrogen or water insoluble nitrogen. Those two phrases mean the same thing. It means that there is nitrogen that is gradually available to the plant rather than available all at once. This is helpful so that you can have sustained growth of the plants in your lawn. Although it can be slightly problematic under less than ideal conditions because those nutrients are only released when moisture levels and microbial activity are just right. Organic fertilizers are inherently a slow release option. A lot of people who are concerned about the environment and water quality are probably inclined to go with organic fertilizers, and they can be excellent. My word of caution on these is that they can contain high amounts of phosphorus. In order to apply the amount of fertilizer you need to give your lawn enough nitrogen, you may end up over applying phosphorus. But that is something that you will, you'll be able to make better choices once you have your soil test results here. And then of course, that last point there, excess nitrogen is excess nitrogen. So apply at the proper rate, no matter what. And then, you know, the standard fertilizer here, of course, is just the normal release synthetic fertilizer. These are helpful if you're fertilizing, you know, later in the fall, you've just established a new lawn, perhaps later than recommended, and you need a quick boost. Also on tough sites, let's say on a slope where you really need quick growth to prevent erosion. And these products tend to be less expensive, but they're high in salts and can cause burning of plants. And they're also more susceptible to leaching because all of those nutrients are available immediately. They'll likely be washed out of the soil before plants can use them. And then a last note here is to avoid combo products. If you suspect that you have a weed in your lawn that you need to control, I would recommend choosing the proper fertilizer and then selecting an herbicide that's appropriate for the specific weed you're trying to manage. Most of these combo products really, they're not the best of both worlds. It's a compromise on both fronts. So if you need to do that, go 2 separate products and skip the spring weed and feed. All right, so back to this same fertilizer label we looked at earlier. We already know that this product is 12% nitrogen. Actually, just back a second, Julia. Great. So we know it's 12% nitrogen, but what you'll see in this guaranteed analysis is that the total nitrogen is broken down into the different forms of nitrogen that make up the total. In this particular product, we have 1% ammoniacal nitrogen and 2.3% urea nitrogen. Those are both nitrogen sources that are immediately available to grass. So there's no change that needs to happen. Those nutrients are there immediately. But then we can see that there's 5.2% water insoluble nitrogen, that WIN nitrogen, and 3.5% slowly available water soluble nitrogen. So if we were looking for a product that has greater than 50% slow release nitrogen, we have it right here with this 8.7% of a 12% total nitrogen that's slow release. All right, and then just a thought here, touched on it a bit earlier, but just think to yourself whether you know the square footage of your lawn. In the study that was done some years back, only 44.6% of people, so less than half, actually knew that square footage. If you need some help figuring out the square area of your lawn, perhaps it's an odd size, or if you need some guidance on how to calibrate your fertilizer spreader, because that's a whole other thing, right? Putting down the fertilizer at the proper rate means having a spreader that's calibrated. There are some really good resources on the extension website. This fact sheet that's mentioned here. There's also a great video on how to calibrate a fertilizer spreader. I will note that a lot of spreaders are specific brands and they are already calibrated for their branded products. Say like a Scott's spreader typically has instructions that go with Scott's fertilizers, but you can use any spreader with any fertilizer if you calibrate it. All right. And then, a question here, is everybody even applying fertilizer to begin with? And about half of survey respondents indicated that they apply fertilizer to their lawns, 10% less than once a year, 56% once or twice, and 31% apply 3 or 4 times. And that's great, actually. I find that encouraging that over half of people apply just once or twice, because that's often all our lawns need if they do indeed need fertilizer. And then a poll question for you all if you'll play along. If you do apply fertilizer, what do you tend to do with the leftovers?
You can type your response right into the chat. Let's see. Alrighty, here. Use it up.
Save it for next use.
Yeah.
Oh, there she is. Use it till it's gone or store it. So yeah, those are all. I'm gonna kick my dog out. And I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay, so probably the best approach here is to just save, what you haven't used up. That could mean putting it in some sort of bin so that it stays dry. But yikes here on this survey that most people just used it up till it was gone. If you're applying at the correct rate, your figuring had to be absolutely perfect to completely use it up in one go. Or in a season. So more often than not, you're probably going to have some to store or give away to your neighbor. And then it's important too to know when to apply. If needed, fertilizer tends to be the most appropriate right after spring green up. So that's really right about now. Typically, I recommend targeting mid-May for your fertilizer application for the lawn. And then if you're going to do a second, then no later than mid-September. The ideal for me is right around Labor Day. You get too much later than that, and the grass is starting to slow down its growth as we prepare for winter. And then those nutrients are going to waste. So ideally, we're trying to target those peak periods of growth so that those nutrients are going to be put to use by the plants. And then I would definitely skip summer too. I didn't mention that, but applying in summer, unless you're irrigating your lawn, it tends to be fairly inappropriate just because that grass will go dormant in the heat. And typically what we have the summer dry.
And sometimes, as I understand it, Emma, the fertilizer applied in midsummer just promotes weeds rather than.
It certainly can. Yeah, many annual weeds are thriving in the summer. So you don't really want to be fertilizing crabgrass or prostrate spurge or purslane, any of those. Okay, and then if y'all just want to take a look at this soil test result here and consider what it's telling us about our phosphorus and potassium levels. When I look at this, it's telling me right off the bat that my potassium level is low. It's in the low end of that range, and then phosphorus is high. So, what does that mean? Well, looking at this alone, I know that I do need to find a fertilizer that has potassium in it, but As far as I'm concerned, there should be no phosphorus because I simply don't need it.
Yeah. So without access to our polls, we can't do our pop quiz today. But
we can here. But just remember here, and when you are shopping for fertilizer, that ideally get your soil tested. If not, still shop for a low or no phosphorus fertilizer, because honestly, it's very rare in New Hampshire that you need it. And then just look for the percentage of slow release or water insoluble nitrogen. Hopefully it's more than 50% of the total.
Thank you, Emma. So we'll wrap up on a couple notes. I'm being lakes folks, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the New Hampshire Shoreline Water Quality Protection Act. And this act does, as you know, have something to say about fertilizer, some important things to say, and that is that application of fertilizer is actually not permitted within that close to the water body. All right. So lime can be applied within this area, the 25 feet closest to the water's edge. Beyond that 25 feet, a slow release nitrogen and low phosphorus fertilizer may be used. But again, we're trying to reduce the potential for runoff or leaching. Because remember, groundwater is connected to surface water. So it's really important to leave a strip of unfertilized grasses and vegetation. If that vegetation can be trees and shrubs, all the better. That's really how we protect water quality, because trees and shrubs are even better at sequestering nutrients and holding soils. All right. For additional information, there is lots of information at the extension website, including video clips, manuals, fact sheets, and you can access it either by typing in landscaping and water quality, or just any topic you're particularly interested in. Just type that into the search engine and it will pull up a variety of resources that you can tap into. I know some folks had questions. What have we got?
Okay, hi Julia. Yeah, there was one back. I'll just go all the way back to the beginning here that I think you guys didn't end up touching on, and that was the question about grubs. If there's any suggestions to treat grubs. I know you briefly mentioned herbicides, but I don't think we talked about pesticides.
Yeah, so insecticides for lawns. So I guess first and foremost, because a healthy lawn can tolerate a substantial amount of grub feeding, is determining whether there's actually enough grubs to even justify a treatment. And the threshold is typically considered more than 10 grubs per square foot. Now, how are you going to figure that out? Well, it requires going out with a shovel and actually flipping over some lawn and counting how many grubs are there. Now, the thing I said before that's important is a healthy lawn. If grubs are a substantial issue and your lawn doesn't seem to be able to cope, it's possible that there isn't a real healthy root system for those plants for whatever reason. Could just be kind of a thin lawn that's not all that healthy. If your lawn is super green and robust and the grubs are still a big problem, then you do have a couple of options. Number one, which is a product that is dubious in New Hampshire, is using a product called Milky Spore. It is a fungal product that infects the grub larvae. It's not shown to be real reliable in New England. It also only affects Japanese beetles. So unless you have Japanese beetles specifically, Milky Spore may not work. Another option is nematodes, parasitic nematodes. These can work really well if the moisture levels in the soil are just right for them. You get really good, healthy live nematodes. And a lot of professional applicators are starting to use these now, but they are expensive and they're a bit of a challenge. If your lawn is right up to the water, That's all I would consider, because you're really going to not be able to use any of the heavy duty other insecticides, systemic insecticides.
Well, would you
So that-
actually describe how, yeah, would you actually describe how people can, how to do that 1 foot transect? You make the slice and at a right angle, so slice down
Yeah.
for. Go ahead.
So ideally those grubs are just going to be right in the root zone of the plant. And so I would just be using a sharp spade to cut probably a square of lawn out. It can be larger than a foot, we can just estimate here, but cut a square of turf out, flip it over, and then count the grubs that are within the roots of that plant or within the hole where that grass came out of.
Okay, well, what else do we have in here? I don't know if you know these numbers off the top of your head, but we were asked if you know how much UNH charges for soil testing, and someone did provide a good link. But do you happen to know?
$20. Yeah, $20 for the standard home lawn and garden test.
Great.
Which gives you everything you need to know with pH and organic matter, and all the nutrients you saw in that sample there, with the exception of nitrogen.
Perfect. And then you mentioned lime there at the end, and that someone is wondering, Ryan's asking, what does lime do for lawns?
So lime actually increases the pH of the lawn, and that's really all it does. Let me back up. It does provide calcium to the lawn as well. If you know that your lawn is acidic, if you've tested the pH and it's acidic, then lime is typically what's recommended. Although wood ash does a similar thing to lime. Other than that, there's no reason to apply it. I think sometimes people get into a trap of just putting lime down year after year after year, just because they know it's something that should happen to a lawn to make it healthy. But over time, you can actually increase the pH of your lawn too much, or the soil too much, and then your lawn has issues for that reason. So important to just keep tabs on it, and you probably don't need to be applying every single year.
Great. I don't think there are any other questions in here yet. Gloria, certainly chime in if I have missed anything.
Yeah. Where do you recommend people go to buy clover seed?
I mean, I have seen some of the garden centers starting to carry it more. I think I found some at an Agway store last year. You may not. So if you're looking for straight clover seed, that's going to be a little bit more challenging. A lot of the lawn seed mixes are now containing somewhere in the ballpark of 5% micro clover, which is a very small Dutch white clover. However, if you just want clover and you don't care if it's the tiny micro clover that's considered ideal for lawns, you can order straight clover seed from some of the big seed companies like Johnny's, because it's sold as a cover crop for farmers.
Okay, well, I'll give just another couple minutes here if anyone wants to type something back in, but I have a question myself. We have heard that clover is great for including in your lawn, so I was a little surprised to hear you say that it shouldn't be more than 10%. Is there a problem? What would be the problems if you include too much clover?
And I brought that one up. Honestly, the only reason why we put that in there is because, as I mentioned, it seems that clover is a really personal taste. And sometimes people will want a little bit, and then they end up with more than they want. And then they call UNH and they say, how do I get rid of my clover?
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think that's really the only reason, is because a little goes a long way.
Well, I'll add.
But she answered a lot of questions about clover on the hotline.
Yeah, well, I'll add too that it can be hard to have a lawn of straight white clover sometimes because it does grow in a clumping habit versus cool season grasses that grow with rhizomes and runners and form this dense carpet. So a lot of times if you try to do just straight white clover or too much white clover, you can end up with a real patchy lawn that ends up letting a lot of weeds come in. So usually it's better if it's mixed in with some cool season grasses. You could potentially do a higher percentage of clover, but I think you'll probably end up with the best results if you keep that percentage low. So just go with a grass seed mix that already has it in it.
Great. Okay, well, we are right at 8 o'clock and I don't see any other questions. Lots of thank yous and a great job and lots of good information. So I do want to thank you both for joining us this evening and providing us with a very informative talk. And I'm sure lots of people will be interested in watching this after the fact as well. So thank you both for giving us some of your time and your expertise.
Thanks for inviting us, Erin.
Okay, have a good night, everybody.